Good evening. We're happy to see you here at Bet Avichai. We have the honor of hosting today Professor Sarna, who is on sabbatical here, so therefore we get to hear him speak and we don't have to go all the way to the States for that. Professor Sarna will be speaking today about President Lincoln and the Jews of Newport. I'd just like to say, what? Washington. Yeah, I'm not good, sorry. I was raised here. My American history is non-existent. Hope my father's not watching. If you're interested in joining us next week and in 2 weeks, you're in the dark. Yeah. Okay. You're welcome to go down to the Kupot, the ticket office, and already get your tickets for the next 2 weeks if you're interested, and we'll know exactly how many people we'll be expecting. And, okay, good sign. Everybody, your phones, please make sure your phones are on silent. Thank you so much. Professor Sarna.
All right, well, thank you, and really a great pleasure to be here and to see quite a few friends from different places, and some older, some newer. I understand why Yael thought I might talk on, oh yes, you can use this. Why Yael, and you're trying to film it, so I shouldn't run around. I understand, the wandering Jew, you know. I understand why Yael thought I might talk on Abraham Lincoln, because indeed, as many here know, I did a book both in English and now in Hebrew on Abraham Lincoln and the Jews. I'll probably mention Abraham Lincoln next week. So, but when Avichai came to me, they actually wanted me to talk about American Jews and Eretz Yisrael. I said that's like bringing coals to Newcastle, and besides a huge literature on the subject. But when I thought more about it, I thought it would be valuable to look at the very early period, which is what we're really going to do, kind of trace the relationship. I said 3 people because I'm going to, in each case, focus on one person, but we'll do other things as well, to trace the relationship really from the colonial period up through Louis Brandeis. I have to mention Louis Brandeis once in each lecture. It's in my contract. So we will get to Louis Brandeis. What we're going to do today is look at early America. Next week, we'll look at the era that really begins quite specifically with the ocean-going steamship, which really transformed the Middle East and made possible tourism and reliable travel. And then in 2 weeks, we'll see what the impact of Louis Brandeis actually was and how he transformed American Zionism. Now, you may wonder, all right, it's clear that I'm in the dark here. All right, or Zarua Latzadik, all right, or maybe not, yeah. Now, the question, when we look all the way back, and for those who don't know, we start American Jewish history in the 17th century. Quite the traditional date, I think it's a good date, is 1654. There were earlier Jews in the New World, but 1654 is the beginning of Jewish community. And you may wonder, did these early Jews really think about Eretz Yisrael at all? Now, if you look at certain older books, especially of some of the earlier American Zionists, their argument was, well, you open up a prayer book, you open up a Siddur, or a Haggadah, and there it is, Lishana Haba'a B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, or V'techezena Ineinu B'Shuvcha L'Tzion, and so on. Problem is, not always easy to figure out whether when somebody utters a prayer, they're really taking literally that idea and anticipating that it will come about. The relationship between liturgy and day-to-day life is complicated and hard to prove. So I want to go in a very different, much less appreciated, and I think much more persuasive direction. And the place to start is to remember that these early Jews who come to the New World are Western Sfaradim. They are Sephardic Jews, meaning that their ancestors were expelled from Spain, but they didn't go to the Ottoman Empire like Eastern Sfaradim. Many of them lived underground as conversos in the Iberian Peninsula, or they later went to Holland. Remember, Holland became Protestant, fought a war with Spain. They were happy to take in those Jews. Professor Kaplan here is one of the great experts on that diaspora. They are Western Sephardim. They went to Holland. Some of those Jews went from Holland to Brazil. Holland captured Brazil from the Portuguese. Recife in Brazil was a kind of Jewish boomtown. We don't remember it, we don't study it, because it's an interesting phenomenon in Jewish history. If someone is looking for a doctorate, you could do a doctorate on one-generation Jewish communities. Jewish communities that lasted one generation. Cuba was such a community, more or less. In the 20th century, there are places in Latin America, Professor Avni knows much better than I do. Cochabamba is 20 years, maybe less. And Recife was like that. 1654, that's why that date is so important. The Portuguese recapture Recife from the Dutch, and under the terms of surrender, the Jews, by the way, also the Protestants, were given 3 months to leave. I always tell my Brandeis students, history teaches them a very important lesson here. If they give you 3 months to leave, take the hint. And those Jews did, and actually pretty well all of the Caribbean communities, even though some of them had a small number of Jews earlier, like Curacao, they all get going from what is really the Recife diaspora. Okay, so this is the diaspora, but what is important is to understand that for our purposes, that because they are Sfaradim, they understand the greatest tragedy that happened to them. A great surprise, Gerush Sfarad, the exile from Spain. They understand it the only logical way for a Jew at that time to have understood it. This is the birth pangs of the Messiah. And that's why there's so much messianism that comes from these Sfaradim. Eventually, there's going to be a false Messiah. Why do they believe in Shabtai Tzvi? Because they're certain the Messiah must be coming. That's the only logical reason we could have had this trouble. And you can get a sense, I just mentioned it, to get a sense of the atmosphere. You get a sense of that imminent messianism even in one of the famous productions of that group of Jews, l'chadodi, yes, yaminu smol tifrotzi, that Hashem taritzi al yad ish ben parzi, that's the Messiah, the nismacha v'nagila, the Messiah is going to come, and finally, our woe will turn to joy. So that's the messianism. That's a portent, they think, of the return. Now, what does all of that have to do with America? And the answer is simple. And you have it here, Menashe ben Israel, one of the great Sephardic rabbis. Some of you have heard of him, Rabbi Menashe ben Israel. Some of you, he's in Amsterdam. He's very important, not for our subject, but for the readmission and the growth of the community in England. But Rabbi Menashe ben Israel writes a great bestseller. It's one of the great Jewish bestsellers. If we had a bestseller list, which we don't, from the 17th century, his book would be on it. One of the great bestsellers of that time. It is translated. I hope all of your books are translated like his was into 6 languages. Its name is Mikveh Yisrael, the hope of Israel. And if you take your handout here, we can see what he writes. I set great store by the opportunity which I have been given to write a work of such weight and importance at a time when people, as wise as they are zealous, are to be found. That zealotry has something to do with their messianism. I've entitled it Mikveh Yisrael, the hope of Israel, taking this title from Jeremiah 14:8, the hope of Israel, the Savior thereof, for its sole objective is to show that this hope which sustains us, that of the advent of the Messiah, is an expectation of happiness to come, although the coming will be difficult. Yes, remember, there are birth pangs of this Messiah every time there's a great tragedy. Jews, even, by the way, the Shoah, Jews initially interpreted it. If you read Hasidim at the rise of Hitler, this is the birth pangs of the Messiah. Although it'll be difficult, it is nonetheless inevitable. For it is founded on the absolute promise of the Lord, may he be blessed. That's the dedication. That puts it in context. Now's the key phrase. The shortness of time when we believe our redemption shall appear is confirmed by this, that the Lord has promised he will gather the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, out of the 4 corners of the world, whence you may gather that for the fulfilling of that, they must be scattered through all the corners of the world, and this appears now to be done when our synagogues are found in America. That's not the Zionist idea. The Zionist idea was you close down everywhere and you come to Eretz Yisrael. But Menashe ben Israel believed, parentheses, if you wonder why Chabad is everywhere, there may not be Jews everywhere like Thailand, but there's Chabad everywhere, it's because of this idea. So it continues to be a powerful idea in Jewish thought that the Messiah only comes when Jews are spread out everywhere. But Rabbi Menashe ben Israel said, there's a good reason the Messiah hasn't come. There was this new world, and there weren't any Jews there yet. But now there are. The Jews are coming to the new world. And that, in a sense, the move to the new world, even though it certainly had good economic reasons and other reasons, it's also part of this great messianic drama. By coming to the New World, we are going to make the Messiah come. We're going to force the Messiah because Jews are everywhere. Now you may say, oh, that's very nice. Prove it. How come? How do I know that Jews who came to America had that idea? And the answer to that is that that if you look at the names of synagogues, people spend a lot of time thinking how they should name their synagogue. I don't know if any of you have ever been part of a new synagogue that's being created, but if you are, you know people think, what should we call our synagogue? And those names are very revealing of what people are thinking. And what is the number one most popular name for a synagogue in the 17th and 18th century? It's not Beth Shalom, it is Mikveh Yisrael. The very same two words as Rabbi Menashe ben Israel's book. And that was not, it's not like you go all the way through Europe and you find, congregations named Mikveh Yisrael. You don't. But you find them all over the New World, in Curacao, in Savannah, in Philadelphia. I believe now that there's one more in the Caribbean. That is the number one popular name. And if you look at other names of New World synagogues, not every one, there are exceptions. Sometimes we can figure out the exceptions. You can ask a question if I don't mention your favorite synagogue. But She'erit Yisrael, what we call the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, is really the same idea, messianism, and that's why I gave you the quote here from Michal, bring together the remnant of Israel, which again, that's messianic. It's not that the remnant of Israel is going to permanently be in New York. It's that by coming to the New World, that will set off the events that will lead the Messiah to come, and then everybody will be taken back to Eretz Yisrael. Or Nidchei Yisrael, which is Barbados, or Yeshuat Yisrael, which is the real name of the Touro Synagogue. It never was known as the Touro Synagogue in the colonial period. Only in the 19th century, when the Touro family gave money, parentheses, that is the first example of historic preservation in the whole history of the United States of America, is the effort to preserve the Touro Synagogue. There are no Jews. At that point, the last Jews have left Newport, but the Touros pay for it to be preserved. They didn't know that they'd spend a long time fighting over who owns the Touro Synagogue, still in court, but that's a different story. But that's when it gets named the Touro Synagogue in honor of Judah and Abraham Touro, who name it after their father, who was the last Chazan of the Touro Synagogue. Isaac, he was a Tory. He supported the British. Don't tell anyone, but nevertheless, that's the Touro Synagogue, and its real name, that's the point, is Yeshuat Israel, and again, that is messianic. And I've given you in each case the proof. Now you may say, oh, that's very nice, but now prove to me that they actually, having schlepped all the way to the New World before steam, it took weeks if you were unlucky, because before steam you relied on wind, and you may not make it. Many more people didn't make it in those days than after steam. How do you prove that they thought that they were planning to go to Eretz Israel? How do we know? I thought they were all business types, and they were. Overwhelmingly, they were merchants. That's why, we don't have a map. That's why they lived in port cities. If you study general colonial American history, you learn about New England towns and so on. If you study Jews, you learn about Savannah and Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, Newport, because that's where the Jews were. Every one of them a port city. The Jews were in port cities. Those of you particularly clever know I missed one famous port. What? New Orleans is not yet part of the United States, and Jews are not allowed to live in New Orleans under the Code Noir. It doesn't mean they didn't live there. Boston. Good, somebody knows a map. I left out Boston, and the reason is Boston, I think, two reasons. Number one, Boston is the most homogeneous of all of the American colonies. Jews preferred heterogeneous communities where there were lots of different people. They could be one among many. Supposedly, New York, New Amsterdam under the Dutch, later New York, someone counted 17 languages, and you had all these different religions, the different denominations of Protestants, so Jews could be there, felt, okay, we won't stick out. If you're moved to the most homogeneous community, you stick out. The other reason is more economic. The port of Boston was less involved in the North Atlantic trade, largely because Newport was a free port and had all sorts of tax advantages. And in any case, it was much easier for Jews to live in Rhode Island, where Roger Williams had allowed them to live. Roger Williams, who, remember, in England supported the readmission of Jews to England and so on, so they moved to Newport and not to Boston. In any case, we have an amazing quote here from Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles in Newport is the important Protestant minister of Newport. He's one of the very few, not the only one, but he is a Christian Hebraist, meaning he was interested in Hebrew. We tend only to study Christian Hebraists in Europe, forgetting that there were Christian Hebraists in America. Governor Bradford, the Puritan in Massachusetts, studied Hebrew, but Ezra Stiles was probably the best of them. Later on, Ezra Stiles is going to leave Newport and become president of Yale University, where, by the way, he insisted everybody needed to know Hebrew because he believed when you get to heaven, if you don't know Hebrew, they don't let you in. So go to Ulpan. He fought everyone to study Hebrew. I discovered, I did my doctorate at Yale, that it was on the books at Yale that you could get your diploma either in Latin or in Hebrew. So naturally, it was a rebellious time, the 70s. I asked for my PhD diploma in Hebrew. They gave it to me in Latin, and I took it. But in any case, Ezra Stiles kept one of the great diaries of the colonial era, and he writes an astonishing story, anecdote, in his diary, which had puzzled people for a long time, and you have it here. The Jews, he wrote, are wont in thunderstorms to set open all their doors and windows for the coming of the Messiah. Last hailstorm, 31 July, when thunder, rain, and hail were amazingly violent, the Jews in Newport opened doors, windows, and employed themselves in singing and repeating prayers for meeting Messiah. Any of you ever been in a thunderstorm? How many of you open your window? Normally, we close our windows when it's a thunderstorm. And of course, that's what caught Ezra Stiles' attention. Most people who read this said, well, he must have been mistaken, he got confused. Somebody said, well, what do you expect? He was a Protestant minister, didn't like Jews very much. But the truth is, he was a very good observer in any number of ways. Ezra Stiles' diary is one of the most important colonial sources, and on any number of things, we rely on him. So why should he have gotten this wrong? And why would he have made it up? And it puzzled me for some time until my attention was drawn to a passage in one of the greatest books of Jewish studies published in the 20th century, the great biography of Shabtai Tzvi by Professor Gershom Scholem. Many of you must know it. And Gershom Scholem writes, the expectation of being transported on the clouds of heaven seems to be authentic. The motif occurs in a midrashic source, and he gives it, the belief was current not only in Russia and Poland, but also in Germany and Turkey. The Sabbatean enthusiasts were not the first to believe in a miraculous journey to the Holy Land on the clouds of heaven. And of course, that's our story. He didn't know, Professor Scholem, that even in Newport, who would have thunk, even in the New World, they had this idea. If you've seen a thunderstorm, the clouds are moving very rapidly. That's how they were going to get back to Eretz Yisrael. And the reason this is so amazing is it is really the best evidence we have that Jews, although they were merchants and spent a lot of their time like Aaron Lopez figuring out this and that and selling as they did, they had a sort of monopoly on whale oil. Spermaceti, it's very good for lighting lamps. When there was a thunderstorm, they still believed that they would be returning to Eretz Yisrael. And they were very messianic, and I think there's a lot of evidence, contrary to what earlier scholars believed, that these colonial Jews did believe that that the Messiah was about to come, and they were expecting to be returned to Eretz Yisrael. And you see another evidence of this in Stiles. This day one of the Jews showed me a computation ending, he says, AD 1783, when the Messiah is expected, meaning Jews really were deeply engaged in messianic speculation. And there's no contradiction. You can be a merchant by day and a mystic by night, and in a way, Menashe ben Israel was that way as well, a merchant by day, mystic by night. Now, what did they actually know about the land of Israel, about Eretz Yisrael? Not much. It's not like they went on the internet and were able to find out about the realia. Eretz Yisrael in the 18th century was quite sparsely settled, and certainly not, there's naturally a dispute, but not a few thousand Jews lived in Eretz Yisrael. Disease and poverty were rampant here. There was a lot of violence. Howard Sacker, whom I actually once studied with, some of you know, wrote a lot of books, son of the founder of Brandeis University. Howard Sacker wrote about this period, about the 18th century. here in Eretz Yisrael, the country displayed all the characteristics of a neglected province, of a disintegrating empire. That empire, of course, being the Ottoman Empire. It is not clear to me that even one colonial Jew had ever set foot in Eretz Yisrael, and that's not a great surprise. How would they have come, and why would they have come? And taking such a long boat ride on a sailboat was very difficult. What you did have, every once in a while, the earliest I know of, that doesn't mean it's the first, it's the earliest anyone has published, beginning in 1759, you had what are known as shadarim, shluchei d'Rabbanan, basically emissaries. If you think that only yesterday Jews learned how to fundraise, think again. That's a Jewish specialty, and nobody was better at it than the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. And if they heard that there were Jews in America who would become to get rich, they would make the trip to relieve them of some of that wealth and make sure that it flowed back to the needy Jews, and they certainly were needy here in the land of Israel. And there are all sorts of shadarim who we have records of. Some of you know, even the great Jewish historian Selo Baron wrote about these shadarim. The most famous in the colonial period, because we have a wonderful painting of him, was a good friend of Ezra Stiles, a man named Rabbi Karigal, Chaim Israel Karigal, originally from Hebron, who comes to, just on the eve of the American Revolution, comes to Newport, gives a sermon, the only published sermon, and it's also a kind of mystical sermon that he delivers. He has many interactions with Ezra Stiles, and then Ezra Stiles liked him so much that he commissioned a portrait of Rabbi Karigal with a big spodek, a fur, they didn't call it a spodek then, but a big fur hat, and we have a big, thick description of Rabbi Karigal and the exotic way that he dressed. And then I guess he figured he'd gotten all the money he was going to get, and he went off to the Caribbean, where unfortunately he passed away. Do not ask me whether any of that money ever got back to Eretz Yisrael. One of the criticisms of the Shadarim was that, of course, they deducted their expenses before they sent any money back, and it wasn't cheap to travel to the New World and go from place to place to place, and it wasn't the most, shall we say, cost-effective way to get money. And later there'll be all sorts of efforts to change that system and rich debates. That's not our subject. The reason I give you that background is because we do have a very interesting letter from, I date it to 1761 because that's when it arrived. It was sent in 1760. The mail then was about the way the mail is today in Jerusalem. But it was written by a man who, you have it on the second page, a man who dubbed himself the Very Reverend Chacham Chaim Modai. He knew how to appeal to American Jews in their language. I'm sure that here in Israel he wasn't known as the Very Reverend and so on. We know a lot about him. He's raised in Tzfat. He becomes a member of the Beit Din of Constantinople, a very distinguished Sephardi scholar. He was an experienced fundraiser, and we know that because he traveled to Europe in 1749 to collect funds. But now a great tragedy had happened. In 1759, there was a great earthquake in Tzfat, a reminder that there are earthquakes in this part of the world, so be prepared. There was a great earthquake that essentially leveled much of Tzfat. Don't tell them I revealed this, but when you go to Tzfat and they show you all those synagogues that supposedly go back to the 15th, 16th, and so on century, not one of them goes back that far, because all the synagogues were leveled and they had to rebuild them after 1759. It's getting close to Lag BaOmer, so don't reveal that. But in any case, it had devastated, and it really was a devastating earthquake, and they needed money to rebuild the city. And Jews all over the world received letters asking them to donate to the rebuilding of Tzfat, and amazingly, and this is a sign that the Jewish community in North America was beginning to be a recognized part of world Jewry, they got a letter too. You know, if you don't get a letter, it's as if, it's like if they didn't call you on Super Sunday. You know, how come they missed me? So when Jews begin to get letters, we know that that North America has begun to be seen as part of the Jewish world. I don't think we're going to go through all of it. I'll leave. You can read it while I'm talking there. But in his letter, Chacham Moda'i described the great misfortune and calamity which our brethren have suffered in the holy city of Tzfat. And this is what's important to me. He encapsulates the central images that Jews in early America associated with their brethren in Zion. If you read it, Tzfat is poor, and that is absolutely the way. Of course, if you're a fundraiser, it makes more sense to say they're poor than they're rich, but Tzfat is poor, it's holy, it's suffering, and its leaders are deeply committed to the continuous study of the holy law, and indeed, Chacham Moda'i says, I had to take time away from learning and study. But think about those images. That's exactly the opposite, a kind of mirror image opposite of America. In other words, Zion is a place where in the midst of suffering and poverty, Jews study and pray, and it's a land in which, in God's good time, all Jews will be restored there. Its values, its practices are the very antithesis of America, where Jews weren't spending so much time learning and studying and praying. Most of them were not poor. They're exactly the opposite. And that idea that Zion is the antithesis of America is a very important one. Philip Roth probably gave it the best name. Some of you know it. He called it a counter life. They didn't know. Anybody read that novel? It's worth reading. They didn't know that term, but they did know that Zion was everything that America was not. And that idea of Zion as a kind of counter life, or reverse image of America lasts well into the 19th century. I read you my favorite quote on that subject. I didn't give it to you, so I have to read it. It comes from a speech of a man who has a street named for him here in Jerusalem. His name was Mordecai Noah. The street is often called Immanuel Noah. I proved that his middle name in Hebrew wasn't Immanuel, but the sign people didn't read my lengthy proof on the subject. His name was, in Hebrew, Mordecai Menachem, but it doesn't matter. Mordecai Noah gets into Jewish history books because he had an idea for a Jewish colony in America, in Grand Island near Buffalo and New York. If any of you have been there, you can still see all that remains, which is the cornerstone. And later he became an advocate of Jewish restoration. He understood well America was not a mini Israel. That's why he called it Ararat. That name is important. Go back to the Bible. Of course, it's related to the word Noah, and his name was Noah, Mount Ararat. But Mount Ararat was in the diaspora. And his Ararat was in the diaspora, and he believed it would be a jumping off point to Zion. But after that, later, at the end of his life, in 1848, which is a very significant year in Jewish history for lots of reasons, but our friend Mordecai Noah gave a speech in which he was trying to collect money for one of these Mishulachim, Rabbi Cohen, who had the idea of building a synagogue in Jerusalem. I believe that it's what turned into the Churva, what we know as the Churva synagogue, which was, one of the early synagogues that Jews who returned built. Mordecai Noah got a bit confused. He thought they were trying to build the temple, not build a synagogue, not because he was a Reformed Jew and they called it a temple, but anyway, I'm sure Rabbi Cohen from Jerusalem didn't exactly explain it, and besides, it was easier to collect money in America for building the temple than for building a shul. But this is what I wanted to read to you, because you'll see it's the same idea as, and then we'll get to George Washington, as Chacham Moda'i. But here's Noah. It has been said that the Jews at Jerusalem are indolent, are disinclined to labor, are only employed in studying the law and devoting all their hours to prayer, and prefer leading a life of dependence and want, same idea, poverty, dependent, to one of prosperous, active industry. And then Noah says, I thank them that they do so amid our worldly cares, our pursuits of gain, our limited knowledge of our holy faith, our surrender of many cardinal points, probably of necessity. I'm thankful that there is a holy band of brotherhood at Zion whose nights and days are devoted to our sublime laws, our venerable institutions. I wish them to remain so. I think it is our duty and interest to share our means with them, to repay them with the bread of life, for aiding us with the bread of salvation. So you get a sense. This is the opposite of America. And really, I'm going to move back in time in a minute, but even as late as 1850, Jews will send money from America to the land of Israel, but very, very few. I can think of one or two, very, very few, travel to the land of Israel. And what we see instead is a different idea, and that's the idea I want to talk about now. We do see the development of an idea that Zion, or at least aspects of Zion, can be found in America itself. Now, that idea actually goes back to the Protestants. So, of course, the Puritans were deep in their belief in Zion in America, and the city on a hill, and all of the rest of it is related to that idea. Lots of the founding fathers of the United States looked to the Bible as a guide for Republican government, and they read the Bible what we call typologically, meaning, oh, Pharaoh is King George. We know that. And who's Moses? George. Washington is Moses, and so on and so forth. And if you don't believe that they thought America was Zion, just look on a map. There are hundreds, to this day, hundreds of American place names that have biblical origins. There are 4 different Jerusalems. There are at least 60 Salems. Anywhere where they couldn't make peace, they called it Salem. Jews did the same. All those Beth Shaloms I mentioned was usually because they couldn't agree, and they thought, oh, we call it Ohavei Shalom, and then everybody will be at peace. Didn't work so well. And by the way, there are also 11 different Palestines in the United States. So maybe our neighbors want Palestine. Maybe Mr. Trump can give them one of them, solve a lot of problems. Anyway, I don't deal in politics. In the 19th century, this is where we have both the Mormons in Utah and the Chautauqua organization in upstate New York literally sought to recreate in space the idea of Zion in America. If you look at the way they organized Utah and the name of the cities in Utah, Moab, and so on, you can see that they thought that was going to be a kind of Zion America. And if you've been Zion America, any of you been to Chautauqua? No, nobody has been there. Chautauqua similarly was set up on the model of Zion. By the way, lots of Jewish summer camps, including Brandeis Bardeen, were also, but that's 20th century, set up in that way as well. But for my purposes, the most interesting evocation of Zion in America comes from what is really one of the greatest Jewish historical documents, anywhere, of the 18th century, the late 18th century, just near the turn of the century, and that is the correspondence between the Jewish community of Newport and George Washington. It's not frequent, people quote a snippet here or there, but it's not frequently enough studied. I don't know if we're going to have time to go through it all, but you can find on the web my commentary. I literally wrote a commentary. Unfortunately, my late father, who really wrote commentaries, didn't live long enough to see. I finally wrote a commentary. I wrote a commentary on it because every word is significant. But and one of the most interesting aspects is this idea of Zion in America that George Washington evokes. Just a word of background: George Washington was inaugurated in 1789. The federal Constitution has been ratified, but only by 9 states, and then two others signed on. But the action, as we would say in Yiddish, the state that didn't want to sign on to the Constitution was Little Rhode Island. It's worried we're not going to get our rightful place Others will trample upon us. It was bound by the Constitution because 9 states had signed on, but it didn't like it, and it wouldn't sign. George Washington wanted the Constitution to be unanimous. Also, the new Constitution before the Bill of Rights in 1791 does not have a guarantee of religious liberty. It did outlaw religious tests as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States. That's hugely important. Everywhere else in the world, even England, you had to take an oath on the faith of a Christian in order to be an officer. In the United States, from day one, a Jew could be president of the United States. Hasn't happened, but the idea that it could happen, we only get son-in-laws. The idea that it could happen was very, very significant. But Jews didn't know whether there would be full-scale religious liberty. The First Amendment was, and that's important. That's why they write to Washington. First Amendment hadn't come about yet. Now, Washington wanted the Constitution to be unanimous. He believed every state needed to sign on. That way they'd be part of it. When Rhode Island said no, George Washington made a tour of all the states, but he left one out. He didn't visit Rhode Island in 1789 because they hadn't signed on. And he was the greatest hero of the day. And it was a kind of quid pro quo. The minute you sign on to the Constitution, I'll come to Rhode Island, Washington said. And eventually, after a lot of back and forth, on May the 29th, 1790, they agreed to the Constitution. Some of you grew up, remember, learning George Washington never told a lie, so he had to go to Rhode Island. Of course, they were in New York in those days. That's where the government was before Washington. 3 days, he didn't wait long, 3 days after Congress adjourns, on August the 15th, George Washington takes this entourage, which included Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and they set off for Rhode Island, for Newport. There are only 2 stops, Newport and Providence. We won't talk about Providence. He gets there, tells you how long it took to travel. He leaves the 15th, so he gets there on August 18th, and 4 addresses. Addresses in those days were kind of open letters. A man like George Washington came, people would get up and read an open letter welcoming him to the city. That's how you greeted a dignitary. So there's an address from the town, an address from Christian clergy, an address from the Masonic order, which, by the way, was led by a Jew, same guy who sends this letter, Moses Satius. But only one of the letters is in any way important, and that's the 4th and last of the letter read out to George Washington, which is from the Hebrew congregation, meaning the Jews of Newport. Now, it is very significant they included those Jews. I mean, it's small, but they had that beautiful synagogue. Any of you been there to the Touro synagogue? If not, look it up on the web. You'll see all the pictures. They had a beautiful synagogue. Its name was Yeshuat Israel. Most of the Jews had actually left town by then because Newport had been occupied during the Revolution by the British, and many Jews left town, and Newport never will regain its importance that it had as a free port. But nevertheless, they stepped up and read this very important letter to George Washington, and that's on your last page. And let's turn to it and really read both sides of the correspondence. You can't understand, people try, but you can't understand George Washington's letter to the Jews unless you read their letter to him. All right. With me here on the last page? Yeah. Sir, permit the children of the stock of Abraham. That's a weird phrase. Why did they say stock of Abraham? What's he? Geza? Okay. Clearly, they didn't want to say Jews. Jews was a kind of dirty word, and it didn't elevate you to call yourself Jew. And as a result, they had all sorts of negative associations. It's interesting, even, by the way, there's a long history. If you go back even to Jonah in the Bible, when he gets picked up out of the water, he doesn't call himself Jew, Ivri. So the idea that to non-Jews, better to use a different word as a long history, he knew the word Jew was often a word of opprobrium. They used this term, stock of Abraham. Of course, it's quite ironic because the term stock of Abraham actually is a New Testament phrase, comes from the book of Acts, where Paul called them children of the stock of Abraham. I can't prove, but I think that's where they got it, and it shows how much Jews of that day were familiar with Christian terminology, but certainly that's what they use. Permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial attention and esteem for your person and merit, and to join with our fellow citizens. We don't have time here when I read this to students. I ask them what are important words here, and they rarely pick up that our fellow citizens is key. Where could Jews call themselves our fellow citizens? And even in the colonies, many of them, they had not been fellow citizens. So that word was crucial to them, our fellow citizens, in welcoming you to Newport. With pleasure we reflect on those days of difficulty and danger when the God of Israel, who delivered David from the peril of the sword. That's a phrase Jews knew. The Hebrew is Apodeh David Abdo Mecherev Ra'ah. Anybody know not the Israeli prayer for the government, but the diaspora prayer for the government begins, Hanoten Shu'alam Lachim Apodeh David Abdo Mecherev Ra'ah, not the conservative prayer. That's a beautiful prayer by Levi Ginsburg, and it's different. But if you go to an Orthodox synagogue, they knew that phrase from the book of Psalms. Podeh David Abdo Mecherev Ra'ah, that's what they're using. Shielded your head in a day of battle. We rejoice to think the same spirit who rested on the bosom of the greatly beloved Daniel, enabling him to preside over the provinces of the Babylonish Empire. Now that's interesting. Why did they choose Daniel? Most of us don't read Daniel much. It's hard. But Daniel is the most mystical of the books. So fascinatingly, they are choosing a mystical book. And Daniel, is it set in the land of Israel? Anybody ever read Daniel? Where is Daniel? Babylon. He's in a central a diaspora land. It's apocalyptic, and there was a lot of interest in the book of Daniel at the time of the American Revolution, even among non-Jews, because a lot of Protestants believed that the revolution was a sign of the imminent coming of the Messiah. They had a different idea which Messiah, but that it had apocalyptic significance was their idea as well. Rest ever will rest upon you, enabling you to discharge the arduous duties of chief magistrate. That's historically interesting. The word president had not come into use. There was a huge debate in America what to call the head of the country. There was a view that he should be known as, in Holland, your high mightiness. We've had one or two presidents who would have liked that phrase, but the tradition is that George Washington, who really was a modest man, he invented the idea that it should be known as the President and Mr. President. All of those things go back to Washington, but clearly they didn't yet know what to call him, so they call him Chief Magistrate in these states. Now, whenever it's true in Judaism, and it's true in this letter, if you read the Shemona Esrei, where do you find the petitions? In the beginning? Who knows their prayers? In the middle. Yeah, first we butter up God, yeah. We say nice things and so on, and then we get to what's really on our mind, that give us good health and so on. So it is with every petition, even when students come to me for an extension. Yes, first they tell me how much they love the course, and they're going to tell their roommate to take it, and then they want 3 weeks to finish the paper. So that's how petitions work. You have to know how to read them. Petitions are in the middle. Now they come to what's really on their mind. Deprived, as we heretofore have been, of the invaluable rights of free citizens. So in case you thought I made it up that citizenship is on their mind, now they say it. In colonial Rhode Island, the great Aaron Lopez, the wealthiest Jew probably in the whole New World, and a very significant figure, had not been able to be a citizen, went to court, eventually got it, strangely, in Massachusetts, which wasn't nearly as fond of Jews, but Rhode Island didn't give it to him. So they when they said we'd been deprived, they knew why. We now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events, that seems to be kind of Masonic language. I found a few, Congress even once made a prayer to the Almighty Disposer of all events. Behold a government erected by the majesty of the people. And now we hum to a great line. A government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance. If you take your finger and move to the other side of the page, you will see, it's right in the middle, that George Washington, like any good politician, then and later, when he heard a good phrase, he borrowed it, and he sent it back to them with a slight grammatical improvement, reversing 2 words, so it scanned better, and that is, of course, the most famous line. It's not, in my view, the most important line, as we'll see, but the most famous line in the letter of George Washington was actually a line that they sent to him. But he understood its importance and sent it back to them later. Generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. Now, why what's going on here? The key word is all. Generously affording to all. They wanted to know all includes Jews. And George Washington, again, understands that very well. But take a look. It's right at the end of the 4th paragraph. When they write to him, they write generously affording to all. When George Washington writes back, he takes out generously affording as if it's a gift. And he writes, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. That is critically important. He is saying, it's not a gift that I give. It's a right. All possess alike. All meaning all, including you Jews. So in a way, whereas to bigotry no sanction, he's just giving them back their words. In this case, he's giving them better. They wrote to him as if, and this was a typical Jewish belief, oh, we have a generous king, he'll be nice to us. He'll give us a benefit. Says Washington. All possess alike. It is a possession. And we'll see another example of that soon. Deeming everyone of whatever nation, tongue, or language. That is strange. There are many explanations. What would we expect? What word is missing? Nation, tongue, religion. There are many explanations in Talmud, as in everything else. When you have many explanations, that kind of means we don't know. I found others who talked about as a phrase nation, tongue, or language. They didn't make up that triad, but it's still strange to me. I'm not going to go into all of the various explanations that have been given. There are many, many of them, but at the end of the day, it's still strange that they didn't mention religion. Equal parts of the great governmental machine, that was the favorite metaphor for government. Michael Kamen wrote a wonderful book about the machine that will go of itself. Machines were magic. A good government works like a machine. Those of you who've dealt with the American government, not so much works like a well-oiled machine all the time, but doesn't matter. This so simple and extensive federal union whose basis is philanthropy, mutual common public virtue, we cannot but acknowledge be the work of the great God, ruleth in the armies of heaven among the inhabitants of earth. That is, again, a phrase from Daniel, doing whatever seemeth him good. And then they go on, having asked for what they asked for, which is citizenship, guarantee of rights, and so on. Then they go back like the Shemona Esrei. Just same way. That's how petition works. You go back and you're thankful for all the blessings of civil and religious liberty which we enjoy under an equal and benign administration. We desire to send up our thanks to the Ancient of Days, the great preserver of men. Masons claim this was one Mason talking to another Mason, using the phrases that maybe some of you are Masons, the Masons tell one another, besieging him. The angel who conducted our forefathers through the wilderness, you know that phrase from the book of Exodus, into the promised land. Now here's a Zion reference, but what's it being applied to? America. May graciously conduct you through all the difficulties and dangers of the mortal life, and when like Joshua, you may say, why didn't they say Moses? And the answer is simple. They knew their Bible. Moses didn't make it to the promised land. Joshua did. Joshua was a military man. It was perfect. When, like Joshua, full of days, full of honor, you were gathered to your fathers. Now, don't try this at home. The Secret Service, if you start writing to the president, talking about when he's gathered to his fathers, you may have a visit. But in the 18th century, death was natural. And there are many letters. George Washington was, after all, quite an old man. And in those days, 60s. And many times they wrote to him, actually got a letter from the freeman of Newport. When you shall cease to be mortal, may you be associated with the realms above. It's a difference, but they were natural about it, and and so were the Jews. May you be admitted into the heavenly paradise. Don't overlook something here. Jews imagine that Christians can be admitted into heavenly paradise. Most Christians did not think Jews could be admitted into heavenly paradise, but Jews have a notion of Chasidei Umot HaOlam. They had no trouble believing that George Washington would be admitted into heavenly paradise to partake of the water of life and the tree of immortality. Done and signed. Again, they do not use Jewish. Hebrew congregation in Newport, August 17, 1790. Moses Seixas, who was a banker in Newport, a very famous and important family, Gershom Seixas in New York. Fine. Signed, he's the warden. Warden is simple, it's still used in England. It doesn't mean he was the sheriff, it means he was the president. The Parnas, they translated as warden. Now, finally, I may just make it read George Washington's letter in reply. Gentlemen, women hadn't been invented yet, so obviously, otherwise he would have said ladies and gentlemen. While I receive with much satisfaction your address, replete with expressions of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain a grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I experienced in the past tense in my visit to Newport from all classes of citizen. Many books, strangely, imagine that George Washington, after he got this letter, got up and like one of the prophets just delivered this response. That's not what the letter says at all, and it's not the way it worked. He gathered up all the letters, he went back to New York. His letter is very carefully written. I know it's carefully written because the correspondence appeared in many American newspapers. There are easily 20 different newspapers that printed it. The only way a presidential letter got into the newspaper, then as now, was if the president leaked it. And he wanted people to know his statement to Jews. So a lot of time was spent crafting this statement, and it is an immensely important letter, still important to this day. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger which are past is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security, if we have wisdom. This was a typical George Washington idea that free citizens need wisdom. If they don't exercise wisdom, they get into trouble. That's still good advice to citizens today. To make the best use of the advantages with which we are now favored, we cannot fail under the just administration of a good government to become a great and happy people. Washington wrote that line to all sorts. That was, he wrote that, everybody wrote a letter to George Washington. The Catholics wrote him, the Quakers wrote him, all the different Protestant denominations. He pretty well wrote the same boilerplate to each one. This business of becoming a great and happy people, this is what we would call state building. Happy people, different from England. We got to build a new American people here. That's what it's about. Moving forward, the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. The founders thought that people all over the world would imitate America, and they weren't so far wrong. We know that people were watching. Even Moses Mendelssohn in his Jerusalem makes a reference to America. People all over were looking. So, and the minute he talks about a policy worthy of imitation, what is the policy? All. We read this earlier. All, meaning all, including Jews, possess alike liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship. And then he goes on with what I consider to be actually the most interesting and important line in the whole letter. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of. And now there's a typo which you can fix in your text, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural right. We're talking 1790s. In Russia, in 1790, Catherine is restricting Jews to the Pale of Settlement. And here's George Washington saying, we're not just tolerating Jews. Tolerate means I really shouldn't allow it, but I'm a good guy. I'll tolerate it. Yeah, I'll tolerate Reform Jews in Israel. I'll tolerate gays. That's not a big deal. He says no. Even though Jews, thank you, would have been thrilled to be tolerated in much of Europe, they're happy to be tolerated. George Washington says, no, it's not toleration, because toleration is an act of indulgence by one group for another. Instead, and this is crucially important, and people do not appreciate how important it is, Jews receive their rights as inherent natural rights. Can inherent natural rights be taken away? No, by definition, they're inherent natural rights. Everywhere in Europe, Jews get their rights as a quid pro quo. We will give you rights, you've got to change. What happens if you don't change? Simple, we take your rights away. Happened all the time, down to the Hitler era. The Jews, the same old Jews, we take away their rights. Inherent natural rights cannot be changed, cannot be taken away. So I'm not among those who think that America's just like all the other countries. This is a big machloket in the field of American Jewry. In this respect, there is no document that I am familiar with that makes this claim in any European country. And there's a reason why many Jews later will come to America. And the discussion of rights is entirely different because it is an inherent natural right. And then he goes on, for happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. We've heard that phrase. That's what they quote. As I say, they reverse too. It's, if any of you are editors, did a slight editing job which made it scan better, requires only that they who live under its protection shall demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Now, there are those who say, wait a minute, I thought you said that this is an inherent natural right. I can't take it away. And now you're saying that you got to be a good citizen and give it effectual support. That implies if you're not a good citizen, I take it away. And indeed, there are those who argue that way. However, if you read through George Washington's letters, which are, by the way, worth reading, you will find that he makes this point over and over again. After all, what did this poor guy have to do? All sorts of people didn't want to pay taxes. First, there's a whiskey. You remember back in American history, some of you? There's a whiskey rebellion. And there's a Shays rebellion. I got in reverse. Shays rebellion came first, and the whiskey rebellion came second. And poor old George Washington, these guys didn't want to be good citizens. They didn't want to pay their equal share. He has to take an army and kind of put down these little rebellions. And he knows perfectly well that unless people are responsible citizens, it's not going to work. Again, a very important lesson in democracy. So I believe this has nothing to do with we're going to take away your rights if you're not, supportive. And everything about a democracy only works if people are good citizens and pay their fair share. And that's as true today as it was in George Washington's day. And He then, after he says everything important, he concludes, it would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I'm pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration, fervent wishes for my felicity, and, may the children of the stock of Abraham, I'm sure he said, okay, they want to be known children of the stock of Abraham, so sein mit Mazel and Glick, I'll call them children of the stock of Abraham, who dwell in this land, continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants. And then we come to a phrase that some of you should recognize. While everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make them afraid. Where does it come from? Yeah, this is of course Micah. And is Micah writing about America? It's also repeated elsewhere. I think Yeshayahu, but the specific, there are slight differences there. You can go home. It's 4:4 in Micah, and look it up. But is Micah talking about America? Of course not. But he is taking Zion imagery. This is the clearest, and that's what's at the end. Taking Zion imagery and applying it to America. It's not that you got to go to Jerusalem so that you can sit under your vine and fig tree and none shall make you afraid. You can do that in Newport. And this is really the clearest. Now, I will tell you something very nice about this, very recently discovered. Now you can do things in computers you couldn't do before. This was George Washington's favorite verse. It comes over and over in his, I want to go back to Mount Vernon to sit under my own vine and fig tree. And it's wonderful. He takes his favorite biblical verse and he applies it to Jews who are not the favorite religion in America. So there's something very beautiful about that. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths. Of course, if you're enlightenment, you love light. That's a wonderful enlightenment image. And make all of us in our several vocations useful here and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy. This is not, people don't understand happiness in the 18th century. We've had too much about Prozac nation, Make us happy, we give everybody Prozac. That's not what it is. Happiness in the 18th century meant ashrei. There is no good Hebrew word for the depth of happiness, English word for the depth of happiness, because we made everything happy, happy this, happy that. Ashrei is a much deeper sense of emotional engagement and happiness, and that's what he meant. It's a sense of well-being, and that's really what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is. It's not take a pop-a pill and be happy. The pursuit of happiness is much deeper. So on that happy note, you get a sense of two visions. They did care about messianic return, but in the meantime, there were lots of folks who talked about Zion in America. So we have 5 minutes if you have burning questions. I'm sorry? Washington strangely did not date his return letter. We know the approximate date because they wrote to him on August 17th. Fortunately, we have, you can even see it online, George Washington's letter book. And in a letter book, those who know what it is, every letter is one after another. So basically, Washington returned to New York, and this was sent out somewhere in the 20s of August. And then had to get to them and so on. I can't tell you why he forgot to date his letter, because he usually did date them. Historians can't explain what didn't happen, and it was an important letter, but it's undated. We do have both the original letter, which you can now see at last, It's a whole story. I won't go into it. The National Museum of American Jewish History, where it was out of circulation for many, many decades. Those of you with a long memory will remember when I and others wrote, and what happened to the letter, and we all thought maybe it had been damaged, but thank God it's now restored, and you can see a copy in George Washington's letter book as well. Yeah?
In what language did that rabbi from Israel speak when he addressed this?
The language when he addressed in Newport is described as Spanish.
No, it was Yiddish. Jump.
It is translated. The question people ask, and we don't have the original, we only have the English translation, is whether it was Ladino. But actually, Ladino is more Eastern Sephardi than Western Sephardi. Ladino is developed in the Ottoman Empire. You can see documents in Judeo-Spanish, which means not with Ladino phrases, but just Spanish written in Hebrew letters. But in this case, my guess is he knew Spanish, and there were Jews who had come from Spain. Aaron Lopez had literally come from Spain, where he'd lived underground. And, it's an amazing story, some of these Newport Jews. They escaped Spain 250 years after the expulsion. They come to Newport. They change their name. Aaron Lopez was Duarte. He becomes Aaron. They undergo circumcision, and they rejoin the Jewish community after living underground for 250 years. But they, of course, knew Spanish. So that's my sense of it. But I do not believe that the original Spanish exists. David, yeah.
Why is it that this letter has become so well known and Washington's other letters to the congregation are basically forgotten?
The other letters are, so as David knows, but some of you may not, the Jews couldn't get their act together. Unlike the Catholics who send one letter to George Washington, Jews managed to send him 3 letters. There's one letter from Newport, there's one letter from Savannah, and then there's a joint letter from all the rest. But the truth is, this is the important letter. There's little doubt. There is, I didn't have time to say this, there's a whole debate. Some people say that line about not just toleration that is spoken of, that Thomas Jefferson, who deeply believed in that idea and was the Secretary of State and was involved, that Thomas Jefferson added that. And if you read it, it kind of looks like it was added with a caret. The editor of the George Washington papers has a whole response. What do you mean? You think George Washington couldn't have done it? And he went on for a long way that it was. And I have to say, even though I was initially sympathetic to the idea that Jefferson maybe wrote it, I went through Washington's letters and I did find places where Washington alluded to that idea. The other thing to note is that this idea of under your own vine and fig tree, it's amazing how a biblical quote can be important. Every time a group is persecuted, whether it's Mormons or Catholics or Jews or later Muslims, you refer again to this letter and that quote. Indeed, Mayor Blumberg referred to this letter that we just read when they had to deal with whether there should be a mosque at the site of Ground Zero, as Americans call it, the site of 9/11. So this letter has vast significance in terms of religious liberty, and as I said, it precedes the First Amendment, and that adds to its significance. Read them. They're all online. I don't think the other letters are as important. We are past 9. I'm happy to stay and take questions, but You may not be happy to stay. You're getting prepared for Shavuos. All right, let me take 2 questions and I'll answer them quickly. Yeah.
Is it known who helped the board to draft it?
We don't know who helped draft it. I'm sure it was a committee. Yeah.
What other religious groups have similar letters to Washington?
Oh, there are. The Catholics have a letter. The Quakers have a letter. In fact, there's a little book of letters to him, and in each case, Washington responded on the basis of what he thought they wanted to hear. The Quakers are really nervous. They didn't participate in the war. They're like the Haredim. They're worried. Maybe we won't get equal rights here. He says, no, don't worry. They do. So good question. Next week, we're going to talk about Ulysses S. Grant. I did a book on Ulysses S. Grant. He visits here. But most people haven't read his letters from when he visited here, and that's what we'll talk about. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
The reason the Newport letter was afterwards, you alluded to it, because the Rhode Island and not yet endorsed the Constitution. They did not want to be Mavayesh, the other Jews, by joining one of those.
Yeah, well, also, that's not what they say. What they say in Newport, it's an earlier letter, they say, the president's coming. We got to write a letter. In other words, we got to give him a letter because he's come there.
They would have joined the original letters, but
the order is wrong.
No, first comes Savannah.
Savannah is first, that's right. Nobody knew about the Savannah letter, but the collective letter is the third.
No.
I think it is.
No, the Newport is the last.
Well, we have to look it up. All right.